Coffee break is over, relationship break is on. We are moving now to a session that is very interesting and probably on the subject that's very touchy. And that is the issue of American Jewish leadership and the relationship with Israel. And it could not have been more sensitive than in the last month or two, as we all know. I would like to tell you who's here on the panel. We have here Rabbi Dr. David Ellenson, who until very short time ago ran the Hebrew Union College. We have John Raskay, who until very short time, ran the largest charity of...
what did I do wrong?
No, nothing. You're still running it. Who ran UJA Federation, which is one of the most important charities here in America. And we have with us Rabbi Joy Levitt, who is still running one of the best JCCs. Ad 120.
She's younger than
Myself, my name is Amir Shaviv. I work for JDC, for the Joint Distribution Committee that does not deal usually with this politics, but in my past, over the last 40 years, I started as a correspondent in Israel television and for 17 years covered issues including the American-Israeli diaspora relationship, as it used to be called. And when I started, the Prime Minister was Golda Meir in Jerusalem, and the King of the Jews here was Max Fisher. And they did have a common language, actually, and did speak it. So, bearing in mind that each one of you runs a big institution, and each one of you has known American Jewish leaders intimately, closely, talked to them in each one of your institution. I would like to hear how you gauge these people. How did they deal with the tension? Because there have always been tensions between American government, Israeli government, American Jewish community. This is not new. I actually looked recently at a transcript of a telephone call between a major American Jewish leader and the Secretary of State, talking about the tension when the Secretary of State is warning the Jewish leader that the Jewish community should not take on the president. And the Jewish leader is saying to him, well, you know, the way your president is behaving, I don't know if I can hold my people. And this goes back and forth. It was the eve of Passover, exactly 40 years ago. And that was Henry Kissinger and Max Fisher. When I looked at it, it was almost something that could have taken place right now on the eve of Passover 40 years later on March 24th, 2015. So this is not a new tension. And I would like, David, if you could, to open and talk to me or to us about that particular junction.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's okay to sit, or?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great.
You could take your tie off, too.
I can take my
You can take your jacket as well.
You can see that Joy is still in charge of things.
And rightly so.
I won't go any further. I think in terms of the question, and I would hope that during the discussion period we might get to quite literally the contemporaneous moment, but as I'd spoken with Stephen Cohen prior to the session today, I thought that perhaps what I might do, at least at the very outset, and I think the way in which you framed it right now in your introductory remarks, of course, reflects on some of the tensions or issues that might well occur. Indeed, you could go back to Ben-Gurion and Blaustein. I mean, it's not something new in terms of American-Israeli relations, that there have been differences of opinion, or one could even say tensions over issues that relate from foreign policy to Aliyah and other issues as well. But I think in terms of my own experience as president of Hebrew Union College, and I'd like to draw on that initially, is that a great deal depends, if we want to talk about American Jewish leadership in relationship to Israel, a great deal depends upon the nature of the kind of organization which one heads. In other words, for many of my friends who are active in organizations like the New Israel Fund, J Street, AIPAC, the Israel Policy Forum, in general, what many of these American Jewish leaders do is they represent certain constituencies among the American Jewish community. And by and large, the kind of tensions that I imagine, and we'll get to hear from people like Joy and Michael, John in a moment.
Hello, darling.
What's your name again? We've only known each other for 40-some years.
Once out of office, that's it.
How soon we forget. It's okay, I have 5 children, and I get them all confused all the time anyway.
Michael's my husband, for those of you who didn't get that
I
reference.
was going to say that this is getting incestuous.
And he's not
But-
here. So love the one you're near. Okay, go ahead.
I think it's if you can't be with the one you
Yes.
love the one you're with, but that's okay. I just wanted to be exact in that regard. But what I did want to say is, depending on the nature of the Jewish organization that one heads, there can be, as it were, relatively little tension for people who, in fact, lead particular kinds of organizations. If, on the other hand, you're head of something like the United Jewish Appeal, or you're head of any organization that has a genuinely large and highly pluralistic kind of membership and support. For example, if you are the president of the Hebrew Union College, you have people on your board who actually support the Zionist Organization of America, and you have people who support J Street. In other words, one might not think that for a reform institution like the Hebrew Union College that you would have significant numbers of people who would be center right to right in terms of the organizations they support in relationship to the State of Israel. I have people on my board, or did, who felt that people like Prime Minister Netanyahu were overwhelmingly too flexible in their relationship to the President of the United States. And I have other people who find it quite problematic that Prime Minister Netanyahu relates to the President of the United States in the way that he does. It then creates, I think, a much, much greater kind of problem for people who, in fact, lead these kinds of organizations in terms of how they're going to deal with these issues, because in some measure, what one has to ask is, how do you measure what I would call an ethic of responsibility, institutional responsibility, for the health of the institution, where you're dependent, your institution, on a large, large degree of donors of different political views in relationship to the State of Israel, vis-a-vis at times virtually your own personal kind of standing. The advantage you have when you do head organizations ranging from the Zionist Organization of America to J Street is that, in general, the people who are leaders of these organizations may feel a great deal of tension in terms of relationship to Israeli leaders at various times, but they're under relatively little pressure from their own constituencies. I say that because their constituencies, in fact, tend to be single-minded on these issues and relatively supportive of the stances that the leaders take. I think when you had another kind of organization that reaches large numbers of Jews of diverse opinions in relationship to the State of Israel, that you have many more kinds of problems. If you had an institution like the Hebrew Union College, the major task is in terms of commitment to the State of Israel itself and various programs that we have. In other words, in part, 15%, 20% of the total budget of the Hebrew Union College is devoted to programs in Israel. That represents, to the degree that a budget represents values, and I think it does, represents quite a considerable commitment on the part of North American Jewry, the Reform Movement, and the Hebrew Union College. I'm just drawing on my own experience right now to the State of Israel. But what you're supporting principally are educational kinds of programs, both for students who are Israelis and non-Israeli students who are there. And so the task becomes, in large measure, how is it, if you're leader of the institution and you're supportive personally of these issues, support then institutionally in terms of the budget becomes simply an extension of what, in my case, my own personal values were. I felt relatively little tension. Had I headed a political organization, it might have been a different kind of issue. But I just think that as we discuss this issue of American Jewish leadership in Israel that one has to understand if one's head of an educational or an eleemosynary institution, it might be somewhat different than the kind of relationship that the head of the United Jewish Appeal might have in relationship to various stances, let's say, that the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the State of Israel might take in relationship to certain issues. The last point I will make in this regard is that there were times as President of the College Institute where I did write op-ed pieces on various matters of Israeli politics, on issues of personal status, for example, and the monopoly of the Rabbanut. For the president of Hebrew Union College to say that I would actually be supportive of a Israel that would be more open and hospitable to Jewish religious pluralism and allow for the recognition of Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, renewal rabbis, that I would be supportive of additional aid being given to non-Orthodox expressions of Judaism in Israel is about as controversial as bringing coals to Newcastle. On the other hand, when one does take stances publicly in support, let's say, of the United Jewish Appeal's decision to grant aid to Arab communities after the Lebanese war in 2006, or that one would take a stance in writing articles in support, at least in principle, of the return of territories, Judea and Samaria, from the standpoint of Jewish religious teachings. I always did have members of my board who were actually quite angry at times about stances I would take. I once had a board member, and this is the last remark I'll make, who wanted to establish a committee that would only allow op-ed pieces to be written by me on any of these kinds of matters when it would be approved by the board. I was always mindful of what I would call this ethic of institutional responsibility. Simultaneously, I felt keilu, as it were, not even keilu, ad kan v'tu lav. I would be prepared to discuss these issues, take into account responsibility I had for an institution, but simultaneously I would not find it acceptable for my board to be able to assert what I could or could not write. Once they select me as president, if it's overly problematic, and now it's really easy for me to say, let them select a new president.
Former
but, what?
Said let them select a new former president.
Let them select a new former president. But I think in that regard, then, these tensions do come up. They're a bit different than the kinds of tensions that you discussed in relationship to the contemporary political scene. But I'd like to listen to my colleagues and then perhaps have more open discussion.
Rabbi Joy, you basically have a board and you have leaders and you know them all and they know you.
Yeah, of
What's
course,
your
the
experience?
problem is what's a leader? You know, in these days, anyone with a computer can appear to be the leader of something, which I think has been a challenge for me. So I run a JCC, and not just any JCC, but because of where we're located, we're the busiest Jewish door in North America. 3,000 people walk in every day. So we take the responsibility of what it means to engage our community with the people of Israel really, really seriously. And over the years, what I've experienced are three different kinds of people in this arena, right? There are bullies, there are people who are emotionally disturbed, and there are people who are constructive critics. Bullies need to be isolated, emotionally disturbed people need to be treated, and constructive critics need to be engaged. And the work is knowing the difference. And I would say that that's the biggest challenge that I experience running the JCC. I would say, with respect to my board, I've had little or no concern, partly because I think simply you do your very best not to have bullies and emotionally disturbed people on your board. That seems to me to be a prerequisite to being me, right? You can't It's just a bad idea. And the reason why it's so important to know the difference is because pluralism on your board is vital. In a JCC, we have to be able to reflect the diversity and pluralism in the community. But that should not be confused with somebody who takes ad hominem personal attacks at other people in the media, right? Particularly now on the internet. So if you write a piece attacking somebody for a synagogue bulletin that she happens to have written, and you actually attack her personally, and 10, 20, 30,000 people get to see that, right? It's not that your opinion may or may not be correct, or that opinion should not be reflected on my board, but I'm just not going to have somebody that picks on people in the playground that way. It's just not going to happen, right? Similarly, and I have to say that, and there are people in this room that tried to advise me unsuccessfully not to give oxygen to people who are emotionally disturbed. It's very hard to tell, right? So sometimes you think you're talking to a perfectly normal person whose views are not your own, right? So if you're me and you're sort of counterphobic as a personality, so you're talking to somebody whose views are not your own, I want to give that person more credence. I want to spend more time with them. I would never want it to appear that I'm, isolating that person. And before you know it, you see like the eyes turn odd, right? There's something that he's not hearing you. There's something that suddenly it occurs to you that this person is actually off. But you don't really know it, particularly when they're writing newsletters, they've got a website, they've got a lot, and by the way, they're being manipulated by people who are not off, right? They're being manipulated by people who are very, very smart in this arena, and that's another piece. And what can happen is if you're overwhelmed by your bullies and your emotionally disturbed people, you then you can tend to ignore the people that actually you want to talk to, that are really constructive critics who have something to say, and it's a lot of muscle to be able to figure out how, when somebody says to you, as somebody did, look, I love the JCC, but I really think you're way too left-wing on Israel. And instead of being real defensive about that, you get really clear that as a JCC, my opinion is pretty irrelevant, right? We're the community's living room on this issue. And we have a responsibility to actually create exciting, interesting, constructive conversations on all sides. I would say that it's been sort of a singular opportunity in our leadership,
Yes.
that is the JCC's leadership, to be able to do that work.
Am I right to guess that most of your leaders are also leaders in other organizations?
Half our board is under the age of 50. So I would say that
Simultaneously, they have positions in other organizations.
there are some people on the board that obviously are on other boards and have had leadership positions on other boards. But for many on our board, the JCC board is their first encounter with the Jewish community.
Thank you. John Raskay, you headed basically the largest charity, and I think you were in Israel at least 4 times a year, usually by average, and you were seen by Israeli leaders, you were seen by American leaders. You were actually in the junction of these tensions when they evolve. Can you tell us a little bit about it, now that you are former?
I would have told the same thing when I was in the position. So, but nice to be here. Great to have this opportunity to talk with colleagues. To the extent to which I understand the issue we're talking about, I think it's a subset of 2 other issues. One is the enormous consequences of having conflated Israel education and Israel advocacy for basically 5 decades, which has left a generation of leaders, and we think this is just a college problem. This is a problem of the North American Jewish community, which simply does not have the educational muscle and context to grapple with Israel. That, a subject, if not for another day, for later. gets compounded by now, in a global world, the increasing globalization of Israeli politics and the extent to which Israeli politics seeks to involve itself in the North American Jewish community for its purposes. In my view, what was happening on the front door of the JCC, which ultimately had something to do with North American Jewish community, had a great deal to do also with Israeli politics and its extension. But let me simply say, I tend to, my 40-year friend Steve Cohn sent us some instructions, so I'm going to respond. He asked us, how do the leaders you know vary about matters relating to Israel? In a sense, how would you segment this market? And then how do they and how did you in your position struggle with the private-public role? So let me first, on the segment, for Steve Cohn to ask me to segment, I feel like, like I'm in Kita Aleph. But holding that aside, I would say I worked, particularly the last 25 years at UJ Federation, with some of the most knowledgeable, sophisticated, fabulous leaders. And I'm talking about people, particularly on the executive committee of 15, fabulous people. So number one in segment, Steve, don't grade me on this. They're obviously 100% deeply supportive of the state of Israel. How they understood that may have varied, but deeply committed and by the way, knowledgeable about the state of Israel and what was going on. That said, I would differentiate, I would say about 60% of those people I called those who idealize and continue to idealize and see Israel as actualizing every one of their core values and the natural consequence of Jewish history and the demands of Jewish history. I saw 40% as being, what I don't have the right term for this, but more policy heavy and want to dig in much deeper into the policy issues and the alternatives. So you did have, even in a place like UJ Federation, a sophisticated number, a significant number who idealized and were basically there, I'm not faulting, to cheer and support and mobilize. On policy, I would say about 60% were hardliners, had little trust of Palestinian or Israelis or the American government, by the way, pretty, what I'm calling hardliners. And 40% I would call more, these are not the right terms, but they were more prone to diplomacy, get into the issues, wanted to see more creativity on Israeli foreign policy, more risks, more opportunities to, they were more troubled, particularly over the last 15 years, of the continuation of the status quo. In terms of settlements, which I think is a divisive issue, obviously, in the community, I would say 15% were pro-settlement always, in part for many reasons, ideologically. 25%, I would say, lean towards supporting settlement activities under the present circumstances, right? Until ba-ba. And I would say 60% were deeply skeptical of the settlement enterprise and believed it was not in the long-term interests either of Israel, the North American Jewish community. Now, that may not have been the segmentation you were looking for. I took it on the question of views, not on age, etc. I did not see a significant generational divide at the leadership level. One would have assumed, might have assumed, that those who lived through closer to the Holocaust, closer to the creation of the state, would have had certain views. I did not see that for a range of reasons which we could explore, but it also has to do with the trend lines in the next generation going on in terms of those deeply involved in the Jewish community. So anyway, an attempt at least putting some notion of segmentation. Now, private views, public views, and views. First, I just want to let you know, when you're the CEO of UJ Federation, you cannot contribute to any political candidate, and you cannot endorse any political candidate in any election. Now, I share that based on what Rabbi David said, to build on it.
Yes.
Because when you actually accept certain positions, you understand it comes with certain understandings. As you said, if I was the head of Peace Now, my job is ideologically to advance a particular perspective on Israel, North American Jewish and diaspora Israel relations. When you accept the role of UJ Federation, take on education. Many of you know I was vice chancellor of JTS. That's not a secret. I have my own, come from, in part, some mix of renewal and conservative movement, etc. But in truth be said, I saw the chinuch, the responsibility to try to strengthen all aspects of the Jewish educational, apart from my personal views, because I thought that was about strengthening Jewish life and strengthening the Jewish community. So, therefore, as CEO, And obviously, I became CEO in 1998, and we had heavy water. I mean, 9/11, Intifada, Intifada 2, war in the North, war in the South, etc. So your public role, I understood as, and I said ad nausea for anyone that was around, to mobilize the New York Jewish community to stand with the people of Israel as they resist violence and in their pursuit of peace. Again, there were no secrets where I came from religiously. There were no secrets where I came from in terms of caring about the future of the state of Israel. So the last matter was not a non-starter. Many people would have stopped at the first part. To be quite specific, to give some flavor to this, one of the funner times was after the Pesach, the horrible Pesach terrorist activity, I think it was 202,
The Park Hotel in Netanya.
which horrible in the middle of the Intifada, and that was what led to the mobilization of the huge rally in Washington. And as a friend reminded me of, since New York UJ Federation is always a very significant financial supporter of such efforts, and we were, I was among that group that would have continual conference calls on the phone. And at one point, very early, the question is, what was the rally going to be? What was the theme of the rally going to be? And there was one person on the phone, a very important person, who said the rally should be, we stand with the government of Israel. And I said no. And I cleared this with our leadership. We stand with the people of Israel. And we had a very strong line. We were not about, in those days, supporting Sharon or Barak. We were mobilizing the New York Jewish community to stand with the people of Israel as they resist violence and in the pursuit of peace. So I'm sharing that with you because a leader like myself, whereas my public role in these matters was obviously, I mean, we'll come back to that, was not one out there, but in multiple private settings, whether it's with prime ministers or presidents, or you were able to try to help our leadership and them stay, in my view, more centered. And that's not easy. A story you might find of interest, I'm in a meeting during the Intifada with the then Prime Minister Sharon. There were 6 of us in his office, including the President of UJ Federation. And he's going on, this is a public relations issue. It's a public relations. I'm new in the job. I'm saying to myself, John, just shut up. Just let it go. It's a public relations office. We need to tell you the story better and better. This went on for 20 minutes, 15 minutes. And I finally said, I'm sitting next to him. And Mr. Prime Minister, I said, it is a public relations issue. We need to do better. We were working then with Giddy Mark and many others to actually try to tell the story better. But in the end of the day, I need to say, growing numbers of North American Jews increasingly see the status quo as a disaster for Israel, the region, the West, and the Jewish people. He grabbed my arm and said, young man, what are you saying? What are you trying to say to me? I said, I'm saying you've often said publicly that you're ready to pursue any opportunities. Increasingly, this occupation, I used the word with him before, he used it, but I don't claim any, like a speechwriter, is increasingly seen as trafe. So I walked out of that meeting, it was pretty intense, and a colleague from Cleveland, who some of you may know, comes up and says, I can't wait until the word gets back to New York. Ruske goes head-to-head with the Prime Minister, to which a key advisor to his says, no, it was an honest meeting, and it was an exchange as opposed to palp. I share that with you because leadership opportunities vary. The public role you have in a job like I had was limited. But the opportunities privately, whether it was to maintain certain the rally was, in my view, by the way, I'll give an example of the rally and the screw-ups that take place, and I'll stop. I mean, this could go on and on. Am I going too long?
No, go ahead.
That rally, we knew Netanyahu was coming to speak. He was an opposition leader then. And there was great concern that that be a balanced rally. We were providing buses to the JCC. And we insisted, and we got we at the committee, that Michael Melchior would be given to speak, and he would speak first, because we feared what would happen after Bibi spoke. For those of you who were at that rally, and I imagine some of you were, you will know that actually Bibi spoke, and the rally was basically over. You ought to know that David Saperstein, my dear friend, was the person in charge of the podium that day. So what happened there was a complicated thing on the bima. But those efforts to have a balance, to make certain that the entire community, that it would not just be one perspective, but that rally would represent the range of opinion in the community was one we've constantly been about. And obviously the efforts of UJ Federation and others to deepen a commitment to Israel education has been another way to try to encourage people to develop their own views, even conflicting views, because we actually believe that strengthens engagement. That actually just asking people to applaud actually becomes very facile, but developing one's own views. And that's why, but all of this means that whether you're Joy or David or myself, leadership, professional leadership, end up being Jewish educators with their leaders to help them understand why we had to write an op-ed piece when the JCC was attacked to, that was not a slam dunk for our leadership. Many would say, stay out. And for David to write. So you're constantly educating your leadership in privacy, while publicly, if you run institutions like UJ Federation, you're trying to keep the broadest perspective on issues related to Israel.
Thank you, John. And you brought up, all three of you brought up a couple of very, very sensitive topics that we all encounter. I can share with you that I work, again, for JDC. The Joint Distribution Committee is a strictly non-political organization, a humanitarian, doesn't deal with politics, not in America, not in Israel. But in the last year, there hasn't been a week almost that somebody doesn't call our offices and want to know if we spending money across the green line, or if we are not spending money across the green line, or what are we doing for the settlers, or what are we doing for the Palestinians. And we almost had to come with a kind of a boilerplate explanation that we are not doing anything geographically. We're helping individuals, we're developing humanitarian programs, and then they're implemented wherever there's need. And we don't recognize any lines anywhere, not in Kosovo, and not in Sarajevo, and not in Ukraine, and also not in Israel. It's not about lines, it's about people. However, all three of you mentioned subject that became a very contentious subject in this relationship. And I can think, one of them that I can think about is the issue of the reform movement and reform rabbis and their status in Israel. I still remember when Shamir's government tried to change the rules in 1988, and a group of you leaders jumped on a plane and rushed to Jerusalem right after the GA to tell the Israeli government, you do this and you can forget about us. And the issues of supporting, when you say that you support the people of Israel and not the government of Israel, there are a lot of discussions on who is the government, who are the people, and who decides. It's one reason why Israel doesn't have a constitution is the first sentence would not fly. We the people of what? Of Israel. Who are the people? Who are the residents? I would like to go back to you, David, and if you can touch upon some of these subjects that were contentious and full of acrimony.
Yeah, I mean, I think, too, just to build a little bit, too, on some of the comments that Joy and John made, just to underscore the issue about the nature of how leadership would be expressed, depending on the organization you had. This divide between public-private probably, again, doesn't reflect itself as much when you have organizations that do really represent certain ideological policy positions, from J Street on the left, that's the one I'll cite, to ZOA on the other side. I would be really interested, and I think on this panel it would be an interesting point in light of the points that you raised at the very beginning today. For a group like AIPAC, for example, that basically asserts that its major position is to be supportive, in quotes, of the government of the State of Israel, and to do so in a bipartisan kind of way. Clearly, the kinds of conflicts that you've had recently between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama and the split between Republicans and Democrats has created what I would think, if I were the head of AIPAC, is almost a nightmare scenario in terms of what my avowed commitments are of the organization that I would head. And I'd love to hear what perhaps some people in the audience, but certainly also you, Joy, and John, would have to say about that. You've now raised another issue quite clearly for the liberal movements in Judaism. The whole debate that often surrounds this question of Mihu Yehudi, who is a Jew. Obviously, all of you know that for purposes of ishut, purposes of personal status within the state of Israel, the Rabbanut has a complete monopoly, by and large, over these issues. And on the other hand, for the Chok HaShavut, the law of return, people converted to Judaism by Reform, Conservative, Renewal, Reconstructionist, rabbis, people who even have one Jewish grandparent can be automatic citizenship is conferred upon them, Israeli citizenship by virtue of the law of return. Fairly often, regularly, led principally by the initiative of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe. I think I can call him the late Lubavitcher Rebbe.
The jury is still out.
The jury is still out. He, of course, in the late 80s, led an initiative that wanted to amend that law so that people converted under non-Orthodox auspices would not be recognized. It led to exactly the crisis that you described. Shoshana Cardin, as head of the
Council of Jewish Federation.
Council of Jewish Federations, was the major spokesperson for North American Jewry during this crisis. And quite clearly, all the way to the present day, you have groups of Reform, Conservative, Liberal, Reconstructionist, Renewal rabbis, and lay leaders who still see this as a major issue. Recently, the American Jewish Committee has become involved because there is a fear that if there continues to be, as it were, disenfranchisement of non-Orthodox expressions of Judaism in the state of Israel and legal discrimination, that ultimately, in a Jewish community where in the non-Orthodox world, and I look to Stephen Cohen, you have more or less a two-thirds intermarriage rate in the non-Orthodox world, people from 2001 to 2012, the reality is that most Jews in North America, or many, who identify with the Jewish community could not be married or buried as Jews within the state of Israel. That undoubtedly will at some point attenuate some of the commitments, perhaps. Shouldn't say perhaps, why qualify it? It will undoubtedly attenuate the commitment that any number of North American Jews will feel in terms of their identification with the state of Israel, leaving aside all issues of the territories, liberal politics, etc. So that these are matters that need to be confronted, certainly in light of the recent elections, and what I'm going to assume will be Haredi representation in the new government. I do not anticipate any major changes. The Messiah could come tomorrow, and if she does, then perhaps a change will occur. But this will undoubtedly have a negative impact. I think the difficulty that it poses for non-Orthodox Jewish leaders and for the larger community is that for many of us who feel committed in the deepest recesses of our soul to the state of Israel, there is a fear that continuing to identify what is this very real issue that creates tremendous tension between diaspora and Israeli Jewry could lead to a weakening of support overall for the state of Israel. So the question of how one does this in a responsible way, that is to say, how to in fact engage in these issues without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, remains an ongoing challenge. One of the questions that has come up to non-Orthodox leadership in North America is that there has been a move recently for civil marriage and even for the expansion of recognition of moderate Orthodox rabbis' rights to perform conversions in the state of Israel. People like Yedidia Stern have really been at the forefront of these efforts. Benny Ish Shalom from Beit Morashah. Question becomes for non-Orthodox leaders, do we in fact support these kinds of compromises that would perhaps make it much more possible for, and you should be aware that you have, give or take, 500,000 Jews in Israel who serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, live their day-to-day lives as Jews. They certainly have sociological identities as Jews within Medinat Yisrael, but halachically, they are not considered to be Jewish because they have non-Jewish mothers. And these types of proposals that people like Yedidia Stern are putting forth would allow for virtually immediate conversion of these people so that they could have the right to be married and buried as Jews within the state of Israel. This would be a palliative, there's no question, in terms of some of the challenges that Israel confronts today in the inclusion of its Jewish citizens as part of its halachic Jewish majority. And on the other hand, these proposals, because we don't yet live in Messianic times, do require non-Orthodox leaders to basically, in these instances, surrender their own claims to authenticity in light of perhaps effectuating a significant compromise in these areas. And I would say that non-Orthodox rabbinic leadership is really very, very much split over these attempted compromises. And again, there is no easy solution. I mean, I could lecture on this at greater length, but let me turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, and I would like to ask Joy. You mentioned bullies, and you mentioned people who are on the verge of sanity in terms of they deal with people who disagree with them. Aren't we generally very quick and very hasty to stick a label of you're anti-Israel to people who express talk about leaders and leadership? That there's a very quick, almost knee-jerk reaction. If you support certain things, we catalog you immediately as you're anti-Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's startling to me is the shocking lack of confidence on the part of different segments of the community around the project, right? The project being the State of Israel. And so that anxiety that it cannot withstand the light of day and the issues around it and the need to sort of say you're anti-Israel. And I speak now on both sides. It's not just on one side of the issue. I always find it surprising. Like, example, Jody Rudaran is coming to speak as part of our Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration next week, and she's speaking at B'nai Jeshurun.
The New York Times.
The New York Times bureau
correspondent in
chief.
Israel. Yeah.
I mean, it is the paper of record, after all. And I got a letter. I will say, there was something quite special about having John running the UJA while some of this was going on for me, because at least I could pick up the phone and somebody was going to answer on the other side. And one of the smartest things that John said to me during that time, it was actually around the Muslim Community Center, but as you may recall, but same thing applies. Count the number of phone calls you get, because as a leader, you tend to over-authorize all the negative stuff and under-authorize all the positive stuff, and you'd be surprised when you add it all up, it may not be as dramatic as you think. So in this case, it wasn't.
Buffalo, man.
It was
Buffalo,
smart.
count the phone
And listen, don't underestimate these little things and how they can drive you crazy. So, but this one letter was, how dare you, they all start like that, how dare you have such an anti-Israel representative as Jody Rudaran speaking at B'nai Jeshurun? Don't you know that the New York Times is anti-Israel, and don't you know that she's arrogant and hostile, and a whole long list of things. But what struck me was not that I agreed or disagreed with the position, but that here we're presenting an opportunity for this guy to come and give her a hard time if he wants. Why did he feel in some way that bringing a speaker to an audience meant that we were supporting that position and not that we wanted to engage our community with, after all, the bureau chief of the New York Times, right? We're not talking about, I don't want to insult anybody's community newspaper, but so.
I know what you thought about.
And the thing is that I find surprising, right? That there's been sort of a category error between bringing speakers in on any side and this assumption that the institution doing that is in support of that, right? And I have to say that I feel over the years that the JCC has been rather successful in debunking this. After all, for a community that I have great anxiety, we haven't defined the word leader, we certainly haven't defined the word community, but to the extent that we're talking about the community I see, which is really radically different than the community that you're talking about, right? We're talking about people
I was
that
just talking about the leadership with whom I work.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, right. But even the organized Jewish community, right, bears no relationship to the people who walk, in and out of our doors. And I worry a great deal about their connection to this conversation. They've basically walked away from the food fight between the people who really care about Israel on either side, people who love Israel but disagree. That being said, 10,000 people came to the Other Israel Film Festival this year. 10,000 people came to look at films that shine a light on the daily life of Arab citizens of the State of Israel and other people who live in Israel who are quote unquote on the periphery. That's a stunning number of people. And I, in talking to them and meeting them, they weren't all on one side of the political spectrum or the other. They just felt the breath of fresh air that exists when you have some confidence in the ability to have these conversations.
Let me make 3 quick points vis-a-vis the community. When we were at some stage of organizing Breira, which was back in about the early 1970s, we had a session with Arthur Hertzberg. And Arthur Hertzberg, may rest in peace, said to us, you know where I disagree? You folks believe that if you mobilize the North American Jewish community, you'll win. I believe you'll lose. I think Queens will trounce you. So what the community is and isn't is always a big issue, and which doors you're at, it's all part of it. Second of all, the only thing I want to say, I think all of us up here, and probably everybody here, are people that believe in exchange, elu ve'elu. We're part of a community of great dialogue and debate. We learn from differences, etc. The fanning of fear, and let's be frank, we live in a post-9/11 world. And the world is less stable, but the role of fear, both generally and in the North American Jewish community, at Iran, and the function that fear has, and I would argue, my PhD is in political science, it's not a neutral here. It has political consequences and people are aware of it. Has a huge fact on, first of all, everybody. And making it difficult, by the way, and truth be said, Iran is real. Many of us have been involved in trying at earlier stages to mobilize the community to deal with the reality of nuclear Iran. Israel is becoming more isolated. I think many of us have different explanations of why that's the case. So the role of fear as a stifle, as a lid on serious discussion publicly among leadership is huge. And I don't think we can minimize it. And I think, obviously many have regret it. Many of us have always been about trying to open discussion on these issues because we actually believe it will lead to greater engagement. But there are many people that don't want to hear. I used to teach a class, some of you, I used to teach what I thought was an interesting class.
Good. Good, because it would be bad if you didn't think
I used to teach a class, and I'd have excerpts from Jabotinsky, Magnus, and either Aleph Dalet Gordon or Ben Gurion, pre-Zionist visions. Because as you know, before 48, you weren't just a Zionist, you had to talk about what your vision was of this future state on economics, socialist capitalist, religion, Jewish state, non-Jewish state. And I always think it's fascinating, because that actually led to, in my view, ironically, without an army, we were successful. After 48, we rallied around the flag, end discussion. And in my view, therefore, the commitment and the depth of the commitment is weaker. Add a little flavor of fear, legitimate much of it, concerned, maybe heightened by some. Not a great setting to be able to have thoughtful discussion and respectful discussion. And I want to compliment, here Joy and Carol and others in this hall, maybe others, who have been pillars of trying to hold that. Some of us have tried to support that. Not easy in the present environment.
So it's interesting because I was going to ask you something since you mentioned Breira and you went back to 1970. I was going to take you back about 20, 25 years ago. You were one of the Americans who were involved in something known as the Israeli Forum. I was one of the Israelis at the time, and you and I were part of that experiment that brought together leadership from the American Jewish community and Israel with the purpose of bridging misunderstandings or clearing them and creating some kind of a unified effort, realizing we are one. We even heard each other saying that it's so important that our children and grandchildren will be able to see each other in the same light. That was a time of great hope, of great expectations, of new horizons opening up, and you were there. Do you believe that this still exists, or do you think this is all gone and time for memories?
Well, some of us, as you know, tried to recreate. This was an annual meeting of the North American Jewish Forum and the Israeli Forum, and it was a very interesting relationship, powerful.
Is it possible today?
What?
Is it possible today to have
Well,
something like that?
I'll probably be laughed out of this room. Some of us have tried to seed that. It hasn't happened. But I wouldn't minimize, actually, what's happening with the mifkashim on birthright. You have 10,000 Israelis participating in mifkashim, in encounters, and by the way, the impact on Israelis appear to be significant. I don't want to overstate, birthright has its own, but the connections that are taking place there on those buses between North American Jewish college kids and, I don't know enough about it, I don't know how much has been studied about it, but it's a different, in other words, we're not going to go back to Moriah and the
Right.
Forum, but there are different contexts. But I think the broader trends of what is happening with the status quo are obviously deeply concerning about what the future relations will be. And I think a prior session dealt with that issue.
Yes.
And I think we will see. But there's reasons some people can argue confidently. I'm deeply concerned about where this is all leading over time.
I think we should open it up for questions. It looks like you don't have to raise your hands. It's clearly everybody has a question. If anybody doesn't have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to be an honest broker, and I'll start with this gentleman over there.
Thank you. I was reporting in Israel a few years ago, and I was in the living room in Haifa of Aleph Ben Yeshua, and he asked me a question, which I'm going to put to you, which is, I understand American Jews want to support Israel. Why do they feel they have to support the settlement? And I know a lot don't, but it strikes me as that American Jewish organizations, by and large, do, or at least won't say that they don't. So could you discuss how you deal with the issue of the settlements within your organization?
So that's one. Let's take maybe two more questions. Yes, please.
You spoke very eloquently about the
It'd be
need-
great to have names, just so we know who's.
My name is Eric Alterman.
There we go. Okay.
Brian Daves. You all spoke eloquently about the need for inclusion, but I was wondering if you could speak at the organizational level of the recent decision, and this actually goes back to Brera's experience as well, but the recent decision to not include J Street in the Council of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, because it seems as though, I mean, obviously the JCC of Manhattan is at in a different place than either the reform movement or federation, but it seems to me that there's some disconnect between what's happening at some of these institutions and at others. And are we talking, I mean, are you talking basically to the converted here? And in reality, that is not what's happening is in your institutions, there's such an effort for that.
What is the question exactly? Can you phrase it?
Can you please comment on what the state of organized Jewry is on the question?
Okay. And one more question. So you with the yes, please.
Asking about ideologically about settlement. David Ellison said that 20% of his funds go into Israel. What proportion of that 20% goes into settlements? And similarly, I want to ask, what percentage of your funding goes to Israel, and what percentage goes into settlements that are clearly within the West Bank?
Okay, thank you. 3 questions. We have settlements, we have J Street, we have settlements. David.
Well, I can answer the last question very easily. None of our money goes to settlements. The money goes to support the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, so it's a percentage of our budget. We have, over the last decade, and in light of John's comment about the mifkashim, the encounters that have occurred in Birthright, There are currently, in the last decade, almost 100 Israelis have been ordained as rabbis by the Reform movement in the state of Israel. Again, I mean, I look to Lisa Grant and Stephen. They may know the numbers better than me, but my own impression is that a good 50 to 60% were shalichim here at places like Camp Ramah or the camps of the Union for Reform Judaism, and they actually had their first encounters with non-Orthodox expressions of Judaism as shalichim in the United States, in North America. And when they came back, it had that degree of influence upon them. A number of our students, in light of the question of territories, who are rabbinical students, are also or have been sarbanim. That is to say that we have a number of Israelis who were officers in the Israeli Defense Forces who have become
Draft refusers, service refusers.
Yeah, they have refused to continue.
Contentious.
They will not serve militarily in the territories. We've had several students who fit into that category. By and large, and here it's interesting, I could go all the way back to a essay written back in the 70s by David Sidorsky, one of our teachers at Columbia, where he points out that in general, not always, there is a significant correlation between what I would call, or what he identified as religious and political liberalism. That is to say, most of the people who attend the rabbinical programs or the education programs of the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem are certainly on the left, on the Israeli political spectrum. Many of our students, all students at HUC, as is true of other seminaries, are required, from our North American campuses, are required to attend a year in Israel. We do allow, not just allow, we encourage groups like Encounter to meet with our students and, in fact, bring them into the territory so that they get to meet with Palestinians during their year of study in the state of Israel, though in general, that is not officially sponsored by the school, but the school certainly looks favorably upon it and does really a great deal to arrange it. In light of the question that was asked about J Street, HUC, seminaries are not part of the president's conference, but certainly the leader of the Reform movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, spoke out very, very strongly in favor of the inclusion of J Street in the President's Council. He was defeated in that regard, and I'd say that he probably spoke overwhelmingly for the majority of certainly Reform Jews in North America. Having said that, there are a lot of people who would dissent from Rabbi Jacobs' position, and he was undoubtedly critiqued for that. From my own perspective, I would certainly hope that the community would be large enough to allow these views to be expressed. In regard to Eric's question, I think there have been leaders of different organizations who've been quite critical of the settlement policy. I think, if I understood your question, maybe you're asking why would a group like AIPAC not be critical? I mean, is that?
No, AIPAC is.
I know. Well, so I'm trying to actually. I mean, I think groups
I'm saying perhaps until very recently, when Netanyahu made it, so front and center, that it was impossible for a leader of an American Jewish organization to take on the issue of settlements without causing a whole great deal of thesaurus within that organization. And now that everyone's retired, with one exception, I want to hear about how it really happens.
But it had,
I don't, I mean, the only difference I would say in terms of, or where I might dissent from you is I think people have spoken out, and I think it has caused a hullabaloo in every case when, in fact, individuals have. For an institution like the College Institute, it has met on different occasions to a degree, let's say as a private individual, although I don't know how one symbolically divides between who one is as head of an institution and one's private views, but there were cases where I did write out on issues of this type. I think it also makes a great degree of
Did it cost
difference.
you donors at any point?
Yes, at times it cost me donors, but at other times it got me other donors. But I think probably what's more significant is that in light of an ethic of what I go back to of institutional responsibility, I once had a board chair said you need to understand that the health of this institution, for better or worse, rides on your shoulders. He said whatever position you take publicly, and one of the reasons I felt the need to on a variety of issues was that I also wanted, particularly for my students who were going to be occupying rabbinic positions, my own position is that rabbis should speak out of the sources of Jewish tradition to issues of contemporaneous concern, from abortion rights to gay rights to matters in relationship to the state of Israel. So to some degree, I felt a responsibility to my students to model it, even as I did attempt always to hope for a variety of different expressions. The biggest problem we had, frankly, at the Hebrew Union College was that given the nature of the student body, and I would say even the faculty, were finding people in quotes on the right. In other words, I've never done a survey, but as far as I know, in 2008 and 2012, I wasn't able to identify more than 5 out of over 400 students who voted for either Senator McCain or Governor Romney. All the rest voted for President Obama in both of these occasions. And on occasions when we've had people from who write for journals like Commentary come to the college, there was one case where a person was treated terribly, quite frankly. There was a complete lack of civil discourse when this individual came, and later on I gave, I think, a degree of tochecha to a couple of my faculty members privately, meaning reproof, or that is to say, I said, look, at an institution like ours, people like this ought to be able to speak. And there were students who were disturbed by the lack of civility that was displayed in these instances. The need for civility in the community is, I think, overwhelming. I mean, there have been times recently where I have taken more public postures than I might have if I were still president. A year ago, not even a year ago, a few months ago, when the Chok HaLa'um, not Chok HaLa'um, what do they call the nationality law?
The Chok HaLa'um, I guess,
Chok HaLa'um,
defining
okay.
Israel, defining
So
the state
there
of
was an
Israel as
attempt.
the state of the Jewish
Now, here
nation.
it was interesting. A left-wing friend of mine who was a member of the Knesset called and said, could you please write an op-ed? We need some help from North American Jews in relationship to this issue in the Knesset. And my friend Deborah Lipstadt, who I know is probably known to many of you, we did write a piece in the Wall Street Journal indicating our opposition to that law. I mean, it's a good question to ask, if I were still the president, would I have done so? Now, Deborah and I more recently wrote a piece where there were attacks. Well, Carol, you get to be mentioned here again. Carol Zabar and other people were attacked. Elisa Doctorow, Karen Adler, I mean, Charles Bronfman, for somehow being anti-Israel because they had given funds to the New Israel Fund. Here,
Radical left-wing
yeah, well,
Okay,
here I
okay.
By
This is the
the
discourse.
way-
Let's keep the discourse on this
By the
one.
way, in terms of attacks on me, I do, in the interest
Okay.
of full disclosure, because I was attacked for this, do want to reveal I have a daughter who works for the New Israel Fund, who is certainly to the left of me in most of her views. But with that aside, I mean, I felt it reflected a lack of complete decency on the part of the people who attack such persons. So I think it can occur left or right. I think it occurs more on one side or the other. But when you are head of an institution and with donors, there are genuine concerns. I mean, the person who would be interesting, fascinating on this panel in this regard would be if you could be a little birdie, in the room or on the shoulder of someone like Eric Fingerhut. He has a very, very difficult job. And again, I think one of the points that I'd like to emerge today, it is just much easier if you're head of J Street, the NIF, or again, for heuristic purposes, the ZOA, to take very, very strong stances in any number of ways than if you're head of an organization like Hillel, where a great many of your funds come from people of significantly diverse political viewpoints in relationship to the state of Israel. The last line here then would be, You know, "Al tadin chavercha shetegia limkomo." It's hard to judge someone until you stand completely in their place. And I guess one last line, when in 2001 and 2, the biggest problem we had was that during the Second Intifada, there were bombings quite literally every day. It was mentioned how often John went. My first 2 years as president of Hebrew Union, I took 17 trips to Israel. 17 trips to Israel. We had 60 students, North Americans who were there. I could not demand that they be there and I not be there. For those 2 years, even as president of the College Institute, I can tell you I know every single one of these students. I spent hours and hours and hours with them because I did feel that the journey to Jewish religious leadership required a firsthand exposure to the state of Israel, even under these conditions.
Thanks, David.
Just to finish, a colleague of mine, and because I'm not president, I'll just say this. All the non-Orthodox seminaries require attendance for a year in the state of Israel, but I will say that there were other non-Orthodox seminaries that had committees that allowed for exceptions during this period. The College Institute really did not. We did not allow for exceptions. Having said that, I stayed up every single night. I could not sleep those 2 years. And I had a colleague who was head of another institution where they did lose a student. And I often wondered if I had lost a student, that is to say, if one of my students had been killed in a bombing, would I have been as unyielding as I frankly was in relationship to this issue? And the answer is, I just do not know.
Thanks. Joy,
Well,
please.
yeah, I mean, I want to say that I think, in fact, you're correct. And if you actually talk not necessarily to us, but to, for example, rabbis out in the field, as it were, you know, it is not uncommon for boards of synagogues to say, Rabbi, you can speak about anything except Israel. And this is said in interviews, and it is said constantly. It's not said the way our boards will say, remember, you run an institution and you have to be mindful. Of course we have to be mindful, but we never feel muzzled by that. But if you are a congregational rabbi and somebody says to you, Rabbi, you can't speak about Israel, like, honestly, you have no business taking that job. But that happens all the time. And I just think that has to be said. And it becomes really problematic. I mean, the truth of the matter is that fewer people are going to synagogues, right? And I don't know that there's necessarily a correlation there, but I think if you stop being relevant, right, if you stop actually letting people talk and expressing their views, and you only toe the official party line, you're going to find fewer and fewer people interested in what it is you have to say. I do, with all due respect, want to take issue with your position around Eric Fingerhut. I think he has the best job in the world. I think the opportunity to shape the way in which college students think about Jewish life broadly and the Israel-Palestine conflict specifically is unprecedented. 90% of our kids go to college. We've totally abandoned them, right? And David and I are on like 5 panels together in the next 2 months, one of which is on rabbinic education. And there it's really clear to me that we're not educating kids to go work on kids, they're not such kids anymore, to go work on college campuses, right? We're educating them largely to go to congregations where there are fewer and fewer people, but there are not fewer and fewer people on college campuses, and it seems to me that he's got a fabulous opportunity, and he ought to, is this being covered?
It has
Okay.
been discussed.
Thank you, JJ.
Yeah.
So I think
different
that
His name was brought up earlier on this session.
That's okay. I just
different
think that he's got a terrific opportunity to sustain the desire that parents all feel when they send their kids to school, which I think Bethany alluded to in the earlier panel, which is to think critically and to have more confidence in the project to simply to have more confidence all around.
I just want to
So,
comment.
go ahead,
One, if you have shuls, the rabbis are told not to be able to deal with Israel. I mean, it's remarkable where we've come to. Think about it. You can say anything you want about Torah, about God, about halacha, anything you want. But rabbis are being told in some places not to talk about Israel. Just take that as a cut on where we are as a community at the moment. And the notion that you can solve this, in my view, on the college campus, apart from the whole community,
can't
which is not allowing Conference of Presidents, not allowing J Street to be in it, which I think was hugely ill-advised, is, in my view, not correct, given the funding patterns and the funders and the craziness that goes with that. I'll just share that with you. I do not
I
believe...
don't know what you mean.
I,
No, I really, can we have this conversation?
If
So,
the
I'm going to leave that alone.
usually I
I do
have-
want to answer your question, though, however.
Usually I have difficulties
To my knowledge,
dealing with
certainly
it.
until June 30th, no funds were given to organizations based beyond the Green Line. Our mission is chesed and chinuch, a federation's mission. So a federation, through agencies like the JDC, will serve any Jew anywhere. But a federation does not provide capital funds beyond the Green Line, does not raise them or provide them, and does not fund organizations there. I just want to clarify that, period.
good. I didn't know that.
And also, just while we're here, federations, just like, does not take a position on settlements. That's an internal, in other words, mobilize the people of Israel, the New York Jewish community, stand with the people of Israel as they resist violence and in their pursuit of peace. It relates to the nature of the organization, the mission, which is chesed and chinuch. Many about all sorts of things, views on the settlements. Last comment. Many of us, Steve, I think, was involved with this. You know, in places like the 1980s, times like the 1980s, we organized all sorts of, back there in the 80s, letters, at front page of the New York Times about the settlement process. You can look at it. Leaders of organizations signed it as individuals. Notwithstanding the organization that was listed, it did not reflect the organization. And repeatedly, those letters and efforts were undertaken to try to curb what I'll call the settlement effort. In my view, it didn't have a whole lot of impact then, and if it didn't have a lot of impact in the 80s, there's no reason to believe that such efforts now would have more impact. And that's
Thank
a
you.
whole issue I just want to put on the table of the relationship of the role of the North American Jewish community in impacting all of this. One man's view, I happen to believe it was exaggerated earlier, and less so now, I mean less significant now, between the evangelicals and the role of AIPAC, which AIPAC is a critical piece in this thing. I think the role of such efforts are not likely to be more successful.
Thank you, John. These were 3 questions, and look at the, well,
Clarify something, because you mentioned a little bit about.
if you give me a second, I will ask and point out to who has to answer that. You will get your chance to ask for clarification. Yes, sir, you are one, yep. Yeah, yourself.
So, my name's Matt from Philly. So kind of in the vein of what Brian asked, but just a different emphasis maybe. You guys talked a lot about like representing all voices in the political spectrum, but it seems to me that the voices that are represented go all the way to the furthest right, but then they don't go all the way to the furthest left. So you are allowing into the conversation people who are okay with a right-wing version of a one-state solution that would erode Israel's democratic character, but you don't allow into the conversation.
Where are you talking about? Where?
Who doesn't?
What's-
What are you talking?
Where?
Question, phrase a question that they can relate to.
Okay, Federation in Philly does not allow Jewish Voice for Peace to be represented on its board. So what do you make of that? Is that temporary? Because we know Bray Ra in the past was anathema to the community, and now Bray Ra is a very mainstream position. Do you see that changing? Or the two-state solution?
Whereas mainstream
wait,
because it doesn't
wait,
exist.
John. You made your you asked.
You're on the Federation, you're UJ.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Carol.
In Israel right now, because I'm in the film business, the 4 film funds have now been told by the government that they must get a signature from everybody who receives money that the film will say on it, made in Israel. This never happened before, and it happened because a Palestinian Israeli said at one of the film festivals that she was from Palestine. Okay. This has had a completely chilling effect on the whole film industry, where there are very few Palestinian Israelis who are gonna sign a thing saying that they are Israelis and making an Israeli film. Furthermore, there are now intimations that there is going to be a Zionist component to it, that you can't make films that are too critical of Israel. That's not passed
And
yet.
receive funds.
And receive funds.
So my point is, all of this has been agreed to by the film funds because the government gives the money. Likewise, in your organizations, do you often or sometimes make decisions because of perceived or real donors that are not going to give to you if you make a decision that you think is right, but that you think that the donor is going to have a lot of trouble with?
Okay, this is the question. You go to the question, Steve?
I presume, as do all of us, that ideas matter, that they actually influence policy. Sometimes, John, maybe they don't. Settlements and communities, but ideas matter. I presume that social networks matter, that, you know, if I repeat something often enough to enough people, they actually come to believe it, or they, you know, come to, and we all do that. So I wanna push all three of you, because all three of you, it's like, this feels like an equal conversation, like this, what you're saying, and then I can film the script, and it said, on personal status, we talked that. On a lot of, on back rooms, sitting next to Sharon, I did something. And look at what I did with the Israel Film Festival. I want to presume that the things that we really care about would be helped by the sitting president of Federation, the sitting president of HSC, and the current executive director of JCC in Manhattan, saying the things that you said right here, right now. That's not on TV. That's going to be preserved forever. I want to presume that it would be better. I think it is fantastic. Thanks a lot. It would be better if you were more articulate and more clear as private citizens who happen to be someone, and that would move our political process to a situation in which we can, you know, maybe influence policy in Israel, but certainly correct the record of mercury. And then I'll Ellison. Here's my last point.
Okay.
A conference that John, you organized with Ismar Shorsh in 1992. Remember when Ismar got up and said, when Bar Kokhba was bringing the Jewish people to utter disaster, we had no record of any diaspora leader telling Bar Kokhba, you're nuts. This is not going to work. Stop it. So in that vein, I remembered, you remembered, that we have to speak out as much as we possibly can. Could you tell us again why you can't push in that position? Why you can't push the envelope one step further? Why can't you be more explicit? Why can't you have the op-ed in the New York Times while you're sitting and not
Steve?
and not elsewhere?
Okay, so in a way, your question and Carol's question are very, very similar in many ways. She says, you make decisions based on the fact that donors may withdraw funds as a result of that, and you're saying, why don't you push further to express positions? Am I right?
No, I'm saying, given the impact you could have,
They could have.
given the risks that you have to take, and I understand the
Okay.
contention. Could you? Why can't you modulate the dial a little further?
A little
to
further.
the outspoken side?
Push the envelope. Okay, Joey.
I
let's
mean,
start with
I
you.
would say that I don't think that there's anything that I've said today that anybody on my board hasn't heard me say probably more than they want to hear. So I don't think there's actually any, I don't have so much competence in that area, right? Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And I mean, I think, look, our work, what shall I say? Donors are also people, right? And our work, even you, Carol, and our work isn't about, I mean, most of the time, it's the tearing of the check is, here's $100,000, get my kid into nursery school, right? That's where I'm most pressured around donors, not on this subject, halavai. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity. One of my favorite moments in this job was when when I was trying to raise money for something else, and the donor said to me, look, quite honestly, I don't really love what you do around Israel. And, it's in that particular case, it was sort of perceived by her, probably true, as more left-wing and not so balanced. It was John's also said this, and maybe this is a little more sophisticated than count the calls, right? Is that every one of those criticisms is an opportunity. Every one of those challenges is because they're willing to talk to you, right? So you have that conversation, you listen carefully. If they're right, you try really hard not to be defensive. Not so easy, but you try really hard. And in that particular case, a really significant gift came out of that conversation. I think the JCC got stronger. And quite interestingly, in this particular case, this particular donor moved somewhat to the left. Simply by her engagement, right? She would never have come to our film festivals before this because she had an opinion, she knew. Now that she was engaged with us in a much more dynamic way, and then on our board, et cetera, started coming to the film festivals, started getting engaged, started getting involved with Israel policy forums. So I think that a simple yes or no to a donor is almost always a mistake.
John?
I think certainly at a federation, once a year, one of my largest donors would call, and he'd be very angry about something that one of the agencies that we support would do. And after he expressed it, he said, one man's view. I think people give, which is a very respectful way. And this is, in other words, have people left? I suppose people have left. Some of what we did, Joy referred to it, some of the support that we provided. It wasn't for Arab communities, it was for all Israelis.
In the north. Right?
In the all Israelis, and by the way, when we started getting the calls on that, one of the things we learned is log each call, find out who these people are, and anyone who's involved with us, call them. And they're an opportunity to talk. Were you really suggesting that when communities were being bombed, when people were coming for help, whether it was medical care, psychological care, we then sit down and say, excuse me, are you an Israeli Arab or an Israeli Jew? Not a one. So in other words, engaging, it was an educational moment. So I know that, I don't want to pretend that a federation represents the entire New York community. Large donors, actually, as represented in multiple settings. It's a very collaborative process. There was a discussion before about what John wants to do. John put out vision and broad strategy. Was not involved in an individual grant, but would defend the processes. I'm sitting here with Marion, who was deeply involved at various stages in that process and many others. It's a very collaborative process. Okay, period. Second, on the views. I said nothing here too that I haven't said. Everybody knew where I was. Everybody knows everything. Ram Dass says it's all on your forehead. Everybody knows where John Ruskay was at. John Ruskay spoke and wrote that he believed the continuation of this process was a threat to the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Okay? I said it in varying ways. I've said it in multiple settings, etc. John Ruskay did not see his role as the head of UJA Federation to mobilize on that. That's not the mission of UJA Federation, period. And when you're in a role like that, you're not endorsing a candidate. You're not making a contribution to a candidate. It's one of the prices you pay. And you accept that, as does the president or the chair and the senior officers. Same thing. Saves the officers a lot of money for the years they're chairs and presidents. They, too, don't make contributions and don't endorse. Why? Because a place like a federation, or I don't know what the hell works, is trying to mobilize the largest part of the community on the issue of chesed and chinuch, not on those issues. I had other opportunities if I wanted to go run something else to mobilize on that issue. That was not the choice I made. You have a view, Steve, it strikes me, that if everyone would just speak out and put their views out there, that would have a huge impact. Where that comes from, given the last 30 years, I know not anymore. There is no evidence to me. No, excuse me. No.
Wait, Steve.
Excuse me, Steve. Ideas matter.
Every think tank has put out ideas and has a belief that the ideas matter.
Steve.
You believe ideas matter.
Hugely, as you know, we've worked on this.
Right.
Look, the problem that, coming from the perspective that you're advancing, is that, let us be frank here, the failure of the Oslo process has had a huge impact on the Israeli movement in Israel. It's had a huge impact here. Add the post 9/11. 9/11 provided a huge prophylactic for a lot of things. Add to that the rise of Iran. So I want to come back. Do ideas matter? Of course I believe ideas matter. And I share that with you, and you and I have had the fun and privilege to work on it, and hope we will long in the future. But the notion of some people in positions put their names on some things would have a huge impact. I'm simply raising that as a question. Okay?
Okay, so, David?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've actually taken any, I don't know that anything I've said here today I didn't write about also when I was president of the college. I did mention the Wall Street Journal op-ed. Maybe I would have written it if I were still president. I don't know if I would have or not. In light of the other question that you've asked, not in relationship to Israel, but in relationship to another issue, I did have a 7-figure donor who really did stop giving as a result of a position with which that donor disagreed. I think I took the right stance by not speaking out in the way that this donor wanted. Having said that, it's already 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. There were a lot of funds that could have helped to pay for professors' salaries, educate people, and would have created programs. And frankly, we looked to get it elsewhere. The point that I made before about Eric Fingerhut, quite frankly...
Wait a minute, did you feel sorry that you did it?
You mean that I...
That you turned away the money?
Wait, Carol.
Yeah, so, no, if you're asking the question, in other words, what am I saying? The answer is, I don't think I made the wrong decision. Having said that, I can't say that I see it as completely black or white, if you want to know the truth.
Consequences.
In other words, from my own position as head of the school, there were millions of dollars that were lost to Hebrew Union College.
Tell us the issue without telling us the name of the donor.
No.
It's not relevant. The issue simply is,
Sure.
It is.
The issue dealt with the question...
Some issues rise to this level and some issues don't.
Okay, the
Yeah, I
issue
would like-
dealt with the question of mixed marriage and rabbinic officiation at them. That was all. And so I have some mixed feelings. By the way, I mean, it might be significant if it were an issue that I felt were a great moral issue of one type or another. I might not have felt badly at all by taking a certain stance. This was an issue where, by the way, in terms of the donor's position, part of me empathized with the position of the donor. I did not think that the donor was completely incorrect in the position that the donor wished me to advance. But let me bracket that for a moment so that I think the only point I would make is that when you're actually head of an institution, you do have these kinds of concerns about how the institution should be run. In terms of the point I made about Eric Fingerhut before, what I was really, obviously he has tremendous opportunity to engage in the kind of educational formation that you suggest, and I would hope that he would do it. My only point was to try to say that from my own position, my own experience, I empathize with him a great deal in this kind of position. Here, the anecdote that I'd relate, I have 1 year in a pulpit. I have 1 year as a pulpit rabbi. We at the Hebrew Union College, I'm not sure about the seminary, it's really best if our professors have no pulpit experience, because in that way, reality need never confuse us about how we know things ought
This
to be
is
done.
the best advice.
But my very first week in my 1 year in the pulpit, I had dinner at the home of the president of the congregation, and her husband came home and said, you know, I made a decision today that I can't believe I made. This man was a printer, and a pornographic magazine had wanted him to do the printing, and this is back in the 70s, and he turned down, at the time, a $2 million contract. He said that his policy was he would not publish or print. He would not print anything that he would not put on the coffee table in his home. But then what I actually appreciated the most about the conversation that ensued, he said, you know, by this point, and we're in Sands Point in New York, and he's by this point extremely successful. And he said, you know, what I have really wondered about is, what if this were 1953, 24 years before? I had 4 children to support. After all, he said, I'm not the one writing this book. He's going to hire someone to print it for him. Would I have made the same decision 24 years ago? The point that he was making was that he, frankly, at this point in his life, was sufficiently financially successful that he could afford his morals, so to speak. Doesn't mean he would not have made the decision earlier.
This
But he
was-
said he just simply did not know. And therefore, I simply want to say that when you're in these positions, it sometimes can be harder than when you do not necessarily have the responsibility for carrying an institution. So how could you not have mixed feelings?
Okay, I would like to try and fit 2 more questions. By the way, this was beautifully expressed in the past by Alfred Doolittle in response to Henry Higgins, and said, "Sorry, Governor, I can't afford morals."
By the way, this woman
remember.
wanted a clarification. She's
Hands.
been waiting a
Show of
long
hands.
time. This woman had wanted a
Yes,
clarification for a long
You know, now
time.
it seems irrelevant, but you mentioned that you had written an op-ed about the question of the Jewish, being recognized as a Jewish state, and my understanding is that when Israel was established, it was a secular state. So when did this,
No, it wasn't.
my understanding is that it was set up as a secular state. So when did this change happen? When did this desire to be recognized in such a way? Was it after the Second Intifada? When did it?
No, no, no.
Oh, no, it
It's
really
always
could
It's
go
the
back
last,
to
it's the last 2 years, basically. It's in the last 2 years during the.
Well, but it wasn't set up.
It was
at-
recognized
the-
as a Jewish state.
the
and therefore
legislation.
The definition of who was a Jew involved Ben Gurion, and it was right there, it was always established in the Declaration as a Jewish state, right there.
Yeah,
What
the-
you're talking about what it means, and it's a constant process of evolution. To be discussed. He gives a
Okay.
great class on this.
It's
I can-
2 more questions before we'll have to sum up. Yes, please, sir.
Hi, my name is Daniel Tryman. You spoke about Hillel, you also spoke about dialogue. I was wondering what you think about the issue of guidelines or limitations on Israel discourse, whether implicit or explicit, whether in Hillel specifically or in your institutions or other institutions in the Jewish community.
Okay, 1 more question, or 2, perhaps. Ma'am, over there.
Talia Hurwich. We've been speaking about creating space for people who want to have dialogues. There's the other side of the coin that there are people who do not really want to dialogue, and the internet is becoming easier and easier to create
Yeah,
a bubble.
you can't control it.
The obvious question being, is it your job as leaders to draw people out of the bubble? And perhaps the less obvious question is, how do you do it?
Okay, and 1 last one. Okay.
Thanks a lot. What John mentioned, the difference between supporting Israeli people versus supporting Israeli government. And I'm just wondering, that is what we usually hear about dictatorships. We hear, well, Iranians are wonderful people, we support the people of Iran, but we object to their government. It seems to me that a position like that, when applied to Israel, does a great disservice to their, democratic principle, organizing principle. It seems to me that it is much, much harder to differentiate between Israeli people and the government in a democracy. We could argue whether it is a democracy or an anarchy,
Okay.
but for the purposes, it's a democracy. And that this is really disrespectful, that position is really disrespectful of Israeli democratic process when we just talk about Israel that way, that the government wants one thing, the people want another. We support the people, we don't support
Thank you.
the government.
Thank you. The question is clear. So we have 3 questions. How do you draw the people out of the bubble? We are talking about guidelines about Israel discourse and the differentiation between supporting Israel, the people, and the government. John, would you like to
I'll
start?
just be quick, he says, and then goes on for a while.
It's okay. I've set a precedent for that. It's okay.
I resisted guidelines. Guidelines first were put on the communal agenda in San Francisco in the wake of the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival, and I resisted that during my tenure there in New York, because I thought we were going to draw the line, and I wanted to encourage, and I don't think guidelines are great. The truth is, on campuses, certainly, where it's about ideas, and in the community, I want to welcome all who, for example, want to celebrate Israel or want to discuss Israel, but that's an ongoing issue. But certainly I, for one, did not think guidelines and where you get into the guidelines and how you understand them becomes its own very divisive issue. I can't comment on the bubble. It's just not my strong suit. I still go to the World Wide Web. In other words, it's just not, it's not my comment. On the question of Israeli government and Israel, I've heard two comments about that today, and I actually think it's interesting. I would say in candor, I think when the Scuds start coming from Gaza, or the missiles come from Lebanon, the desire of the constituency most involved in UJ Federation is to actually respond in some way. They see members of their mishpacha or their of their people endangered, and what do you do when someone's in trouble or someone's sick? You write a check, you arrive, you rally, etc. I think many of those people have all sorts of disagreements about the Israeli government, what they're doing about the Scuds, how they got to the Scuds, maybe we could have avoided the Scuds, but actually there's a broader desire to respond. So in those instances, in other words, there are many different instances you're involved with. UJ Federation has been deeply involved in multiple areas of Israeli life, which is supporting religious education for secular Jews, is supporting community development, supporting all sorts of things. But in those situations, and particularly at times of crisis, I think it allows people who have all sorts of mixed views about the politics of the moment and what brought them there to respond in human ways to the people, and that's what actually those efforts are about. It's standing with, so at those moments. So, but I find your comment interesting. I want to say it, and thank you.
Joy, please.
Yeah, I think I agree with John broadly about limitations, but I would add, and
Guidelines.
perhaps, on the issue of guidelines, but I think your questions are sort of the same, which is that to the extent that we have limitations, they're more about behavior than they are about ideas, right? So if you're interested in real dialogue, I'm interested in talking to you. If you're interested in shouting and screaming and death threats, and, we had a demonstration from an organization this summer. One of the Israeli organizations in town asked us to do they wanted to hold, they were running it, we were just providing space, a memorial service for fallen Israeli soldiers. And of course we said yes. And I was actually sitting Shiva for my father-in-law, and I get a call from my office. There are 150 people outside with placards demonstrating against this event downstairs. Bethany actually saw it. There were like these placards, "Free Gaza," in front of the JCC. I mean, we're important, but let's be just really clear. Right, Bethany was coming to swim and saying like, why? Because it wasn't really so clear that there was, but I have to say that I was deeply offended at the notion that these young Israeli kids were walking into the building, having lost people in the war, feeling very ambivalent about being in America, not being there, their family, their friends, wanting to participate in this memorial. By the way, all day there had been these attacks on the internet about this event. How dare the JCC hold an event in which we are not also mourning the death of Palestinians? This, of course, was a big assumption, which turned out, in fact, not to be true. The organization holding this expressed tremendous anxiety and sense of despair about the loss of life on both sides. They were not interested in this. They were interested in using this opportunity to advance the cause of their organization. So I would welcome a dialogue about whether the Gaza war was a good thing or a bad thing, but I would never invite that organization in that context, because I thought they just behaved badly. And I would say exactly the same thing on the right. I've gotten, John referred to these demonstrations, like it got very serious. At one point, my security guys had to actually ask me for the address of my mother and my sisters and my children, because there were internet threats on my family's life, right? So that's not about a position. And that's why I set out that way of structuring it earlier, because I think constructive criticism on any level is going to be welcome, and bullying is never going to be welcome.
Okay, David, you want to refer to these two questions?
I think that in educational institutions, the whole purpose is to encourage reasoned dialogue. I, again, may have my own positions, and indeed many of the people in our institution do, but I would think virtually any opinion would have the right to be expressed as long as it was done in a civil, relatively rational manner. That doesn't mean that I would argue that institutions do have a right to have established guidelines, but I don't know that in this case, one size would fit all, and I guess it would depend on the nature of what the institution would be. Certainly in an educational institution, I think virtually any opinion could be expressed, so to speak, as long as reason was left free to combat it. That's a quote from Thomas Jefferson that's on the portal of the University of Virginia when you walk in its gates onto the grounds.
Can I add a comment if I may?
Yes, of course.
I think, I'm just thinking about this conversation. It strikes me what the subject is when you put it together. It's the role of leadership and communal organizations in a post-paradigm moment in Jewish life. In other words, Jonathan Wucher captured in Sacred Survival
Yes.
the overwhelming paradigm of Jewish life, which
Right.
extended, let's
And we
argue,
looked at that. That's a
into
good
the
point.
late 80s, early 90s. OPEX took it maybe up till, and that's broken down. So now what this subject is really about is the role of leadership and large communal organizations in this period, and how you actually engage, mobilize, connect with Israel in this time. It used to be, I was being pejorative talking about, the moment of advocacy. All we asked American Jews to do was come out and clap, and there was tons to clap about. But it wasn't deep. Now the issues are really complicated, settlements, Iran, what to do, Bibi with the president. We don't have an educational muscle to deal with it, and we don't have a paradigm. In other words, we are able to mobilize the community on an issue like Mihu Yehudi because you have overwhelming consensus.
Yes.
But now the combination of the breakdown of the paradigm, the politicization, the extension of Israeli politics into North America is obviously what makes this moment so complicated. And you've heard from three who've been trying to navigate this, but my intuition here is this is only going to get more and more challenging in the years ahead.
In many ways, John, you started the summation or the sum up that I was going to suggest because we have about 10 minutes. David, did you want to relate to the question of this gentleman about supporting Israel or supporting the government? Is it disrespectful?
Oh,
That's what J Street does.
You ask your question, yeah. Did you see any disrespectful element in saying that we're supporting?
no, I mean, the way I understood it when John made the comment was to say that there are people who dissent or support specific policies. I think he meant, this is at least how I understood it, was that it was not a comment on anything like the democratic process. It was an attempt on the part of a diasporan Jewish leader in the aftermath, I would say to some degree. I mean, now I'm picking up on what John just said of the overwhelming consensus that formally marked the community on issues in relationship to Israel, that to employ the term the people Israel, as I understand it in that context, simply means that one continues to have an overarching support for this state and its citizens, even as one would perhaps be extremely critical of policies, maybe of the current government in any number of areas. So that I don't think I understand it principally as a comment on the democratic nature of the Israeli government.
Okay, so to sum up in the minutes that are left, final statements, if you can. Joy, may I start with you?
Is there anything more to say?
You can decline.
Look, I mean, I think what John just said is actually very, very important to understand. These are very disruptive times, and old paradigms are over. Institutions themselves are, I think, in a very challenging way. Federations, synagogues, JCCs, all of these are 19th and 20th century institutions that are moving into the seminaries, moving into the 21st century. Those that will survive are the ones that are able to deeply listen to where people are at and make very hard right and left turns in order to accommodate the new realities of the 21st century, which are really radically different. And I think on Israel, very specifically. But I remain, quite optimistic that when people come together, really listen, when we resist fear, when we encourage when we encourage people to go, when we encourage people to come, when we're really in this in a serious way, that Israel still, for me, remains the most important project of the Jewish people, and I'm in it for the long haul. And I think as a leader in Jewish life, that's my role and responsibility.
Okay, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Joy and John have basically said all of it at the end, and I actually don't have anything more to say than what has been said.
John? That's it?
All I would say is that, I said the mission of a federation is Chesed, Chinuch, V'Klal Yisrael. It's about Jewish peoplehood. I unpack Jewish peoplehood as identifying with and feeling collectively responsible for Jews and Jews throughout the world. In other words, in this world of renewal and identity, you can go on an individual trip of Jewish identity, right here, make Shabbos, have a great time in your shul, etc. This question of global Jewish responsibility interests me a lot, what it means to feel related to and responsible for. I think that's the mission of certain institutions like a federation. The question of, I believe Jewish life would be strengthened if there were more people, I have my deep personal views, trust me, they probably come out here a little bit. But I believe Jewish life and Jewish engagement with Israel would be strengthened if there were more people, whether it's with Peace Now or the Zionist Organization of America. Because that relates to people having thought through what they believe, what Israel should be, can be, might be. So the role of each institution, and I think David began it, institutional, what their role is and the mission is differs, and that affects what leadership does in them vis-a-vis many issues, politics here, Jewish education here, and Israel.
Thank you, and I want to thank this panel of three gentlemen and one lady that really run institutions that make a difference in the Jewish world, and I'm at all because I work with all three of them, and they are terrific. Thank you.
Probably would have been interesting to have a little more diversity.